A comic book convention. A Comic-Con is an event with a primary focus on comic books and comic book culture, in which comic book fans gather to meet creators, experts, and each other. Commonly, comic conventions are multi-day events hosted at convention centers, hotels, or college campuses. They feature a wide variety of activities and panels, with a larger number of attendees participating in cosplay than most other types of fan conventions. Comic book conventions are also used as a vehicle for industry, in which publishers, distributors, and retailers represent their comic-related releases. Comic book conventions may be considered derivatives of science fiction conventions, which began in the late 1930s. Comic-Cons were traditionally organized by fans on a not-for-profit basis, though nowadays most events catering to fans are run by commercial interests for profit. Many conventions have award presentations relating to comics. At commercial events, comic book creators often give out autographs to the fans, sometimes in exchange for a flat appearance fee, and sometimes may draw illustrations for a per-item fee. Commercial conventions are usually quite expensive and are hosted in hotels. This represents a change in comic book conventions, which traditionally were more oriented toward comic books as a mode of literature, and maintained a less caste-like differentiation between professional and fan. The first official comic book convention was held in 1964 in New York City. Early conventions were small affairs, usually organized by local enthusiasts, and featuring a handful of industry guests. The first recurring conventions were the Detroit Triple Fan Fair, which ran from 1965 to 1978, and AcademyCon, which ran from 1965 to 1967. Many recurring conventions begin as single-day events in small venues, which as they grow more popular expand to 2 days, or even 3 or more every year. Many Comic-Cons which had their start in church basements or union halls now fill convention centers in major cities. Nowadays, comic conventions are big business, with recurring shows in every major American city. Comic book conventions in name only. The biggest shows include a large range of pop culture and entertainment elements across virtually all genres, including horror, animation, anime, manga, toys, collectible card games, video games, webcomics, and fantasy novels. Wizard Entertainment is the industry leader in these types of conventions, with ongoing shows in 21 American cities. San Diego Comic-Con International, a multi-genre entertainment and comic convention held annually in San Diego since 1970, is the standard-bearer for U.S. Comic-Cons. According to Forbes, the convention is the largest convention of its kind in the world, and is also the largest convention held in San Diego. According to the San Diego Convention and Visitors Bureau, the convention has an annual regional economic impact of $162.8 million, with a $180 million economic impact in 2011. Internationally, the largest European comic book festivals are Lucca Comics and AMP Games and the Angoulême International Comics Festival. The world's largest comic book convention, in terms of attendees, is Japan's Comic-Con, which boasts annual attendance of over 500,000 people. History. Origins. In 1961 and 1962, Jerry Bales was vital in the formation of the Academy of Comic Book Fans and Collectors, the first official organization of comic book enthusiasts and historians. The ACBFC brought fans of the medium together, administered the the first industry awards, and assisted in the establishment of the first comic book conventions. The Academy's first order of business was to administer the Ali Awards, which traced their origin to a letter to Jerry dated October 25, 1961, by fellow enthusiast Roy Thomas, in which he suggested to Bales that his fanzine alter ego create its own awards to reward fandom's favorite comic books in a number of categories, in a manner similar to the Oscars. The first Ali Awards, given for the calendar year 1961, were reported in Alter Ego No. 4. On March 21, 1964, the first annual Ali Tally by CBFC members was organized by Bales at his house in Detroit, with the purpose of counting the Ali Award ballots for 1963. This became notable in retrospect as the first major gathering of comics fans, predating the earliest comic book conventions, which were held later in the year. Attendees included Ron Fost, Don Glutt, Don and Maggie Thompson, Mike Vosberg, and Grass Green. Comics historian Bill Skelly notes that the Ali Tally and even larger fan meetings in Chicago helped build momentum for these earliest conventions. In addition, an unnamed convention held May 24, 1964, in the Hotel Tuller, Detroit, Michigan, was organized by teenagers Robert Brush and Dave Zurek, with assistance from Bales and members of the Michigan Science Fiction Society. This gathering featured about 80 fans of the comic book medium. Tri-State Con, the first recorded official comic book convention, took place in 1964 in New York City. Known as the Tri-State Con aka the New York Comic Con, it was held July 24, 1964, at the Workman's Circle Building, a one-day convention organized by 16-year-old Bernie Bubnys and fellow enthusiast Ron Fradkin. Official guests of the Tri-State Con included Steve Ditko, Flo Steinberg, and Tom Gill. Reports were of over 100 attendees. 1965, the first recurring conventions, continuing the momentum from the previous year. Bales, Sheldorf, and the members of the Michigan Science Fiction Society formed the organizing committee of the groundbreaking multi-genre convention Detroit Triple Fan Fair, which was held July 24–25, 1965 at the Embassy Hotel in Detroit, Michigan. The DTTF was held annually in Detroit until 1978. Meanwhile, in New York City, teacher comics enthusiast Dave Kaler had taken over as ACBFC executive secretary. The organization produced Academy Con, held July 31–August 1, 1965, at the Broadway Central Hotel. Under Kaler's leadership, the Academy produced 3 successful Academy Con shows in New York during the summers of 1965 to 1967, attracting industry professionals such as Otto Binder, Bill Finger, Gardner Fox, Mort Weisinger, James Warren, Roy Thomas, Gil Kane, Stan Lee, Bill Everett, Carmine Infantino, and Julius Schwartz. As befitting a convention run by the Academy of Comic Book Fans and Collectors, the Ali Awards were presented at all 3 Academy Cons. The 1965 Academy Con also featured one of the first recorded superhero masquerades, or costume contests. 1965 also saw the genesis of what became the annual Italian comic book convention Lucca Comics and Amp Games. Ronaldo Traini and Romano Calisi held the Salone Internazionale del Comics in Bordi era. In 1966, it moved to a small piazza in the center of Lucca, and has grown in size and importance over the years. expansion and growth. In 1966, comic book conventions continued to evolve and expand. The July 23-24 New York Comic-Con was held at the Park Sheraton Hotel in New York. Produced by John Benson. Guests included Jack Kirby, Jim Steranko, Otto Binder, Len Brown, Larry Ivy, Jack Binder, Roy Thomas, Gil Kane, Archie E. Goodwin, Bob Stewart, Klaus Nordling, Sal Trapani, Rock Mastro Sirio, and Ted White. Featured events included a keynote speech by Kirby, a discussion about censorship between Don Thompson and Comics Code Authority Acting Administrator Leonard Darvin, a panel about the golden age of comics, and one on the so-called forgotten 50s, particularly EC Comics. Bob Stewart, on a panel with Archie Goodwin and Ted White, predicted that there would soon be underground comics, just as there were already underground films. Meanwhile, the first Southwestern Con was held in Dallas, Texas, organized by Larry Herndon. The official guest was Dave Kaler. About 70 attendees took part. In 1967, new conventions were inaugurated in St. Louis and Houston. The Houston Con ran biennially and then annually until 1982. In 1968, two important conventions had their start, taking over for the Academy Con. Brooklyn native and schoolteacher Phil Searling hosted the International Convention of Comic Book Art at the Statler Hilton Hotel in New York City, on July 4–7. The guests of honor were Stan Lee and Vern Hogarth. This annual convention, which later became known as the Comic Art Convention, hosted the presentation of the Alley Awards from 1968 to 1970. CAC ran annually over Independence Day weekend until 1983. In England, Phil Clark produced Comic-Con 68 at the Midland Hotel, Birmingham, from August 30 to September 2, 1968. Member guests include Alan Moore, Paul Neary, Jim Bakey, Steve Moore, and Nick Landau. There were 70 attendees. The British Comic-Con ran annually, variously in Birmingham, London, and Sheffield, until 1981. The 1970s and explosive growth. Comic book conventions increased dramatically in the 1970s, with many of the largest conventions of the modern era being established during the decade. In the early 1970s, conventions sprang up in almost every major American city, as well as in London, with Comic Mart, a trade show which ran regularly until the mid-1980s. Comic book creators, editors, and publishers began to make it part of the routine to attend conventions as official guests. On August 1–3, 1970, Sheldorf produced the Golden State Comic Con, held at the U.S. Grant Hotel in San Diego. Official guests were Forrest J. Ackerman, Ray Bradbury, Jack Kirby, Bob Stevens, and A. Van Vogt, and it drew 300 people. The three-day show evolved into San Diego Comic-Con International and now attracts 130,000 or more attendees. The Creation Convention debuted in 1971, organized by 14-year-old Queens schoolboys Adam Allen and Gary Berman, and held over Thanksgiving weekend at the New Yorker Hotel in New York City. The guest of honor was Jim Steranko. For that point until the late 1980s, Creation Entertainment continued producing large annual conventions in New York City, usually taking place over the weekend following Thanksgiving. A popular venue for the Thanksgiving cons was the Statler Hilton Hotel. In the mid-1970s, attendance at the New York Creation Conventions averaged around 5,000 fans. The admission was around $5 per day. The 1971 Comic Art Convention was notable for being the convention credited by Will Eisner for his return to comics. Nostalgia 72, held July 22 22–23, 1972, at the Pitt Congress Hotel, was the first Chicago area comics and collectibles convention. Produced by Nancy Warner, the show had about 2,000 attendees. The show evolved into the Chicago Comic-Con, and attracts more than 70,000 attendees annually. The Angoulême International Comics Festival debuted in Angoulême, France, in January 1974. 10,000 attendees made it the most successful inaugural comic book festival to that date. 1974 also saw the first Orlandocon, organized by regional chairman of the National Cartoonists Society Jim Ivey. Guests included C. Beck, Roy Crane, Hal Foster, Ron Goulet, and Les Turner. Orlandocon ran annually for 20-plus years until 1994. In 1976, there were then 20 comic book conventions held throughout the United States. Many of them attracted thousands of attendees. Around this time, specialized shows began popping up, focusing on such topics as underground comics, EC Comics, women in comics, and individual creators like Frank Frazetta. In August 1979, Fantaco Enterprises publisher Thomas Cullen produced Fantacan 80 at the Egg Convention Center, Empire State Plaza, in Albany, New York. The first annual Albany Area Horror and Comic Book Convention, Fantacan, ran annually until 1990. Creation Entertainment spreads its wings. Beginning around 1980, Creation Entertainment expanded the conventions beyond New York, producing cons in San Francisco and Washington, D.C. By 1983, the company was the leading producer of comic book conventions nationwide. For instance, in 1986, Creation produced large-scale comics conventions in at least 6 cities, including Philadelphia, Los Angeles, New York City, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., and New Brunswick, New Jersey. During this time, Creation branched out from comics and began producing conventions in the horror and science fiction genres. They were particularly known for their Doctor Who conventions. After 1988, the company stopped producing comic book conventions to focus on their other, more profitable, fan conventions. The 1980s. Both the Heroes Convention and the multi-genre Dallas Fantasy Fair debuted in 1982. Heroes Con is one of the largest independent comic book conventions still operating. During the heyday of the Dallas Fantasy Fair, it was one of the largest comics conventions in the country, third in attendance behind the San Diego Comic-Con and the Chicago Comic-Con. Comic book conventions spread to Canada and Switzerland in 1985. Also debuting that year was the United Kingdom Comic Art Convention, first held September 21–22, 1985, at the University of London Union. Guests included such UK stars as Steve Bissett, Bill Sienkiewicz, Dave Sim, Marv Wolfman, Brian Bolland, John Bolton, Eddie Campbell, Alan Davis, Hunt Emerson, Brett Ewins, Dave Gibbons, Ian Gibson, Dennis Gifford, Alan Grant, Gary Leach, David Lloyd, Mike McMahon, Alan Moore, Steve Mort, Paul Neary, Kevin O'Neill, Ron Smith, Des Skin, Brian Talbot, and John Wagner. Admission was £7.50 for both days. UKCAC ran annually until 1998. A number of still extant conventions debuted in 1987, beginning with the Wonderful World of Comics convention held at the Oakland Convention Center, in Oakland, California, later to be known as WonderCon. The convention was founded by San Jose native John Barrett, owner of the retail chain Comics and Comics. The multi-genre Dragon *Con also debuted that year, hosted by the Piermont Plaza Hotel in Atlanta, Georgia. Official guests were Michael Moorcock, Robert Aspirin, Lynn Abbey, Robert Adams, Richard Lord British Garriott, Gary Gygax, and Toastmaster Brad Strickland, and there were 1,400 attendees. In 1988, in commemoration of Superman's 50th anniversary, the Cleveland Convention Center hosted the International Superman Expo, held June 16 to 19. Official guests include Kurt Swan, Jerry Ordway, George Perez, Marv Wolfman, and Julius Schwartz. By the end of the 1980s, comic book conventions were evolving into sprawling affairs that promoted films, television shows, celebrity performers, video games, toys, and cosplay as much as comic books. Many historians date this shift to the release of Tim Burton's Batman film in 1989, which sparked the convention circuit's newfound embrace of Hollywood. Great Eastern fills a gap. Great Eastern Conventions produced comic book conventions for nearly 20 years, but most actively during the years 1987 to 1996. In New York City, the Great Eastern shows filled the gap after the mid-1980s demise of the annual Comic Art Convention and Creation Conventions. From 1993 to 1995, Great Eastern hosted 2 New York City shows annually at the Jacob K. Javits Convention Center. Great Eastern also ran shows in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Oregon, Minnesota, Texas, and South Florida. Despite the large fan attendance and expansive venues, however, Great Eastern's large shows were criticized by many within the industry for pandering to dealers and spectacle. As frequent participant Evan Dawkins stated, the New York shows are extremely unfriendly to both creators and fans. There is limited programming, limited professional appearances at these shows. In March 1996, Great Eastern, at a very late point, cancelled what had been advertised as a larger-than-usual New York show, scheduled to be held at the New York Coliseum on 59th Street NAMP, Columbus Circle. As a substitute event, comic book retailer Michael Carbonaro and others on the spur-of-the-moment mounted the first Big Apple Comic Con, now a long-running show. Greenberg and Great Eastern Conventions disappeared from the fan convention circuit from that moment forward. Small press conventions and comic book festivals. In response to the big conventions shifting focus away from comic books themselves, a number of small conventions sprung up in the mid-1990s that turned the focus back onto comics, particularly those not published by the big mainstream companies DC Comics and Marvel Comics. Many of these indie cons were inspired by Cerebus creator Dave Sim. In 1992, Sim partnered with Great Eastern Conventions in promoting small conventions in over 20 U.S. locations, including Indiana, Oregon, Texas, as well as in South Florida. And in 1995, Sim toured the country in a self-styled 9-stop Spirits of Independence tour. The antecedent to these new comic festivals may have been BerkeleyCon 73, held April 20 to 22, 1973, at the Pauley Ballroom, ASUC Building, University of California, Berkeley. BerkeleyCon was the first convention devoted to underground comics. The first exclusively small press conventions were Caption, which debuted in Oxford, England in 1992, the Alternative Press Expo, which debuted in San Jose, California in 1994, and the Small Press Expo, which premiered in Bethesda, Maryland in 1994. Wizard Takes Over. Wizard Entertainment purchased the Chicago Comic-Con in 1997 to expand from its core publishing business into trade, consumer conventions. In just a few years, the now renamed Wizard World Chicago event boasted a weekend attendance of over 58,000 people. Wizard World Chicago was the template for a new kind of convention that shifted its focus from actual comic books to ancillary elements of pop culture fandom, celebrity performers, films, television, video games, and toys. Comic conventions, almost in name only. In 2002, Wizard produced Wizard World East in Philadelphia, a still ongoing show. They added ongoing shows in Texas in 2003, Los Angeles in 2004, and Boston in 2005. Beginning in 2009, Wizard made a concerted push to dominate the U.S. convention circuit, as it began acquiring existing conventions and starting new ones in various cities. To begin, Wizard World acquired the Big Apple Convention, New York City's longest-running multi-genre pop culture convention. In 2009, Wizard World also acquired the Paradise Comics Toronto Comic-Con. Beginning in 2010, Wizard Entertainment produced a North American Comic-Con tour. City stops included Toronto, Anaheim, Philadelphia, Chicago, New York City, Austin, and Boston. By 2013, Wizard conventions included Portland Comic-Con, St. Louis Comic-Con, Philadelphia Comic-Con, NYC Experience, Chicago Comic-Con, Ohio Comic-Con, Nashville Comic-Con, Austin Comic-Con, and New Orleans Comic-Con. And in September 2013, Wizard World announced 7 new stops for the 2014 tour: Sacramento, Louisville, Minneapolis, Atlanta, San Antonio, Richmond, and Tulsa. This explosion in Wizard-produced conventions brought accusations that the entertainment behemoth was deliberately trying to push its competitors out of business. On the other hand, many praised Wizard's professional and standardized approach to producing conventions. Conventions as big business. Starting in the mid-2000s, ongoing comic book conventions sprung up in most major U.S. cities, most of which are still ongoing. These pop cultural gatherings attract tens of thousands of fans and generate millions of dollars in revenue every year. In addition to the Wizard-run conventions, Comic-Con International runs the San Diego Comic-Con International, WonderCon, and the Alternative Press Expo, while Reed Exhibitions runs the New York Comic-Con and the Chicago Comic-Con AMP Entertainment Expo. Types. Since the first conventions in the mid-1960s, hundreds of local and regional comic book conventions have sprung up around the world, either as one-time or annual events. At these conventions, fans of comic books come together with the professional writers, artists, editors, and publishers of the field to discuss its many aspects. Increasingly, comic conventions have expanded in scope to encompass the gamut of pop culture phenomena relating to comics, from film, television, and animation to gaming and collectibles. Some cities have a number of Comic-Cons. Nearly every weekend of the year now has at least one convention somewhere, and some conventions are held on holiday weekends where 4 or more days can be devoted to events. Commercial shows versus volunteer conventions. An important distinction can be made between commercial events, those run by dedicated companies who specialize in con organization, or by local for-profit firms, and volunteer-run cons. Usually run for-profit, commercial events tend to charge for tickets or admission, rather than having memberships. A primary focus of commercial events is meeting including celebrities such as stars of TV shows and movies, professional wrestlers, glamour models, etc. There are frequently very long lines of people waiting for autographs at commercial events, while famous actors like William Shatner of Star Trek are paid tens of thousands of dollars per convention. Minor and obscure bit players pay to set up booths to sell autographs and memorabilia. Commercial events also tend to have less small-scale programming. Panels will more often be composed of famous actors, directors, etc. On press junkets, where the panels are held in very large rooms with very high attendance, the largest conventions tend to be commercial ones. Commercial events tend to be more likely to be about popular visual media than volunteer cons, and they also tend to attract the younger generation. But this is not absolute by any means. Some commercial conventions have been known to aggressively go after fan-run conventions via the legal teams. The volunteer conventions, on the other hand, tend to be smaller in scope and more intimate in character. Although there are frequent autograph sessions, they tend to be less of an attraction for volunteer cons. Admission to volunteer cons is usually called membership, thus emphasizing that the fans themselves are the ones who make up the con, rather than the staff who run commercial cons. A community of fans who run such conventions has developed, and many of them share the best practices and keep convention running traditions alive. Comics festivals and indie shows, so-called comics festivals, are based on a European model started by such long-running conventions as Luca Comics and Amp Games and the Angoulême International Comics Festival. Festivals are much more focused on the art and literature of the comics form, and only minimally on related pop culture expression and merchandising. In the U.S., comics festival and indie shows tend to highlight the alternative comics genre, not the work of mainstream publishers like DC Comics and Marvel Comics. Cosplaying is rarely if ever a feature of these conventions. Some notable North American small press conventions include Alternative Press Expo, San Jose, California, produced in San Francisco for 15 years. Small Press Expo, Bethesda, Maryland. Small Press and Alternative Comics Expo, Columbus, Ohio, produced by small press publisher Backporch Comics. East Coast Black Age of Comics Convention, Philadelphia, focuses on black creators and characters. Mocha Festival, New York City, originally produced by the Museum of Comic and Cartoon Art, now produced by the Society of Illustrators. Toronto Comic Arts Festival, Toronto, produced by the retailer The Beguiling. Comic Expo, Bristol, England, produced by retailer Mike Orwood. Stumptown Comics Fest, Portland, Oregon. Staple, Austin, Texas. Brooklyn Comics and Graphics Fest, Comic Arts Brooklyn, Brooklyn, New York, produced by the retailer Desert Island Comics. Chicago Alternative Comics Expo, Chicago, Massachusetts. Independent Comics Expo, Boston, Rhode Island. Independent Publishing Expo, Providence, Rhode Island. Comics Only shows. Comics-only conventions emerged in response to the sprawling, pop culture-focused conventions epitomized by Wizard Entertainment, San Diego Comic-Con International, and the New York Comic-Con. Comics-only shows tend to harken back to the comic book conventions of the 1970s and 1980s, still focused on the genres of superhero, fantasy, horror, and crime, as well as dealers selling back issues and other collectibles, but without the domineering presence of the mainstream publishers or film and television producers. Notable comics-only conventions include Baltimore Comic-Con, Big Apple Comic-Con, East Coast Comic-Con, Heroes Convention,